We have Elizabeth coming up next. Elizabeth McGuane, she's a senior UX manager at Shopify. She leads UX, including design, content strategy, research, and UX development for Shopify's app platform. Elizabeth is a content strategist who's worked in UX for the past 13 years. She previously led the content design practice at Intercom. Elizabeth's talk today will be about how her skill set as a content strategist has helped her describe the fundamental parts of complex products and how those same skills can help your product not just grow, but evolve. So let's have a big round of applause for Elizabeth McGuane.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the claps and the cheers from the back. I have some pals in the audience, which is always nice. I'm Elizabeth, as we said. I'm a content strategist, also called a content designer, also sometimes called a UX writer. But I'm also a senior UX manager for Shopify's app platform. And I've taken a really odd journey through user experience design. I studied English literature, and my first job was as an editorial assistant at a print newspaper in Ireland. And you might not think that that beginning has much to do with apps and infrastructure, and on some days I would agree with you. But I actually think that they have more in common with each other than you might think, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. So because of my background, I know that the first dictionary in English was written in 1604 by a clergyman called Robert Cowdrey, and it was called the Table Alphabet. It has a much longer name in real life. And he pulled it together from lists of words that he found in other texts. And there were earlier dictionaries than this in other languages, and there were also dictionaries used for translation, say from English to Latin. But what was interesting about dictionaries at this period is that they tried to define words that were hard to understand. I think it actually says that up here, for unskilled persons who are trying to understand complex words. The idea of defining every word in common use just wasn't common at the time. People used words as they felt they should be used. The way we in the public see dictionaries today is very different. Every year, the Oxford English Dictionary chooses the word of the year, and every year, Twitter just erupts with dissent and dismay. People argue over whether things are actually even real words, as though all words aren't a human invention. It's a kind of a toxic situation, which was last year's word. But that is not at all a dictionary maker's real job. A dictionary maker, a lexicographer, collects and analyzes how humans use, make, and remake words. And what's interesting about that to me is that it's a research-driven view, and it sees that words are never solid. They shift and change meanings, even swap meanings to their complete opposite all the time. The concepts that we have in our products, in our companies, even in the team domains that we cover, are always changing as well, and that's what I want to talk about today. How many of you have experienced failures of communication at work? Yes, thank you. Maybe you didn't understand company jargon when you first joined, or maybe a few months went by and somebody else joined and you used jargon to them, they had no idea what you were talking about. Or maybe, and I myself have done this in the last 6 months, you named a project, and when you told people what the project was, people thought you were building something totally different than you actually were. Or maybe it was the end of a project and you were trying to categorize features or products or put them in a navigation. Or maybe you were trying to organize categories within a search domain or try to build some kind of AI tool or any technical product that is essentially about the categorization of meaning. Anytime we do this, I find that it tends to turn into this kind of battle royale. We leave it till the very end of the process, and I've seen this over and over and over again in the 13 years that I've been doing user experience. So let's take my world, the world of platforms. So what is a platform? A platform is an entirely conceptual thing. It doesn't really exist. It could be the entire product that you're making. It could be all of the things that all the teams at Shopify are building is a platform. Or you could say, no, a platform is just the parts of our product that we're exposing to third parties. Or if you talk to an engineer and get technical, you could say, well, it's just the APIs. And what happens if the structure of those APIs changes? Or say you change from REST to GraphQL, does that actually change the fundamental nature of what the platform is? So the concepts that we use to define what we're building really matter. They're what helps people understand what it is that we are making. And when we skip the step of concept clarity, we really do damage to our entire process. So if you think about concepts of a platform from a user's point of view, it's really about a foundation for someone's business. A platform is what third-party developers, speaking with Shopify, are using to actually build apps and products for their customers, and their customers are also our customers. So if they don't understand the parts of our system, the parts of what make up a platform, if they don't understand how those parts connect to each other, which are higher or lower priority, then they don't really understand what it is that we're selling to them, and they're not going to be able to build an effective business on it. I think concept clarity is the core of all good design. If you can't agree on what something is, how can you know how you want people to understand, use, and even pay for it? You have no way of knowing if you're finding product market fit if you don't know what you're selling, and you have no way of telling your teams whether they are all building the same thing if you can't define and describe it. So before I joined Shopify, I founded and led content design, basically content strategy, at Intercom in Dublin on the R&D team there. And it's a great company with a laser focus on good design. When I started, they said that their biggest problem was with naming. And I said, okay, and I rolled up my sleeves and I said, I'm going to create a glossary, and we're going to publish it to the outside world to keep us honest and authentic about how we're defining our concepts. And there was this huge appetite for clarity at Intercom. When I joined, the product engineering team were the ones who were championing this principle called same language from code to customer. So they had this lofty goal of making sure that the words that they used in their code were the same words we would use to show to our customers in our product UI and documentation and everywhere else. There was this real desire for consistency, and it was really beautiful to see. Hard to achieve, but beautiful to see. And the company was pretty young then. It was about 4 years old when I joined, but they'd already changed some product names, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I myself wanted to change how they framed who their customers were. At the time, they called their customers admins, which was very technical, not scalable for when they wanted to introduce permissioning, and didn't really speak to the new audiences that they were trying to reach at the time. So in the process of putting this glossary together, I basically had to be a lexicographer. I had to be a dictionary maker. I had to go around the company and look for definitions of concepts in blog posts and documentation and just talking to people. And I quickly realized that there were vastly different mental models of the product across the company. Now, I just want to pause for a second and give you my definition of a mental model versus concept model. They're often intertwined, but I think the differences are very important. A mental model, to me, is a framework that you have as a human being in your own mind to explain how something works. It's not just the words you use to define the system, it's also which objects you see as higher or lower priority, how you relate them to one another, and even which object you start with when you're telling your narrative of the framework. It's the user journey that exists in your mind. A concept model is a framing that you as a company or a design org or a designer present to somebody else. It is something crafted. It's an official way of conceptualizing a framework or any kind of system. And we often talk in design reviews about presenting mental models to customers, but actually that's not how it works. You can't really control what exists in someone's mind when they encounter your product. They'll bring in experiences of their own and words from other products and their own background. But what you can do is make sure that as a company and as a design team, you all have a shared understanding of the concept model that you want people to increasingly understand and adopt. So quickly back to the glossary. So once I realized that people weren't seeing the world in the same way, and there were no common definitions, I teamed up with a user researcher, and we went to talk to people in sales, customer support, product design, product engineering, and so on. And what we found was pretty surprising. It was not just that people used different words, but why they used them. What we found was that the activities that people did every day, the role that they occupied, the things that they learned from the peers closest to them, and even how close they were to customers affected their entire mental model. And it wasn't just that if they were closer to customers, they would use the customer's language. There was one example of somebody who worked in sales who described the place you landed in the admin when you first opened the product as the dashboard. This was not a term that existed anywhere else in Intercom. I had never heard anyone else use it. It wasn't in any of our documentation. But because this person was a salesperson, when they were selling the product to people, they wanted to give over a sense of simplicity and to say, when you open the product, you're going to see everything in one place. And dashboard felt like the right word for them. So it was interesting for us to understand not just what words people were using, but why they were using them. So once we worked through these organic sort of group mental models, we used that context to arrive at a concept model that the whole company could agree on. But what was really important about that process was that we understood the context that people were in and the understanding they already had, so we knew how far we had to go to close the gap between their current understanding and what we were trying to introduce, rather than just introducing a model that we came up with in a room and then delivering it to them and expecting them to get it. So a company is kind of a semantics machine. We're constantly creating meaning all the time. We're constantly creating new things. And we've just seen that meaning changes all the time, and meaning exists in different ways in different places in a company. But we really resist grappling with this change. So I wanted to talk about how we can get better at dealing with it and why it's so hard in the first place. So names define us to ourselves and to the world. And I once wrote a kind of pretentious blog post about this where I used the metaphor of the ship of Theseus, which is pretentious but also accurate because it describes that if you replace every board in a ship as it travels, when it gets to its destination, is it still the same ship? And I've often been fascinated by this concept that if you replace the name of every feature in a product, is it still the same product? How much power do the handles we give to things actually have? And what actually influences people to understand the small piece of your product or the whole of your product? And I also want to talk about when you know when it's time to define the future. How do you know when it's necessary to create a concept model? You know, you might not have one right now. You might be growing organically and kind of wildly in your company, but you might have started to recognize a need for consistency. Or you might be starting to hear things, people saying things like, well, it's always been called that, or that's just always the way it's been. And to me, that's always a signal that something needs to change because people aren't examining why things are called that and why they're structured that way. Or it might be that the need for change is coming from outside, and you're starting to need to speak to new audiences in new markets, new parts of the world, who don't use the same language that you do and don't think about things in the same way that you do. So sometimes the old way of doing things just doesn't make sense anymore, not just for your company and where it wants to go, but for the customers that you want to serve. So I believe that identifying the moments for change, identifying the moments when you need to transform your concept model, comes down to three things: audience, cost of change, and timing. So this is just another small example from Intercom. When I joined the company, as I mentioned, they did some name changes. And at the time, all their products were named after jobs to be done, which is a methodology that the whole company follows almost religiously. And at the time, they had a bunch of different products. One was a support product, and they called it Respond, because the job you're doing when you reply to support tickets is responding. Now, what they found is that when people got into the product, that name was okay. But when they were top of funnel trying to adopt the product, the name just didn't really resonate with them. So they heard that audience feedback, and they came up with some simpler names. Respond became Inbox. They had a marketing tool. I can't even remember what the jobs to be done name was, which shows you how unsticky it was, because I lived with it for a year and a half, and it became Messages. So what's important there, and I'm not calling out Intercom, it actually wasn't my work that solved that problem. It was the marketing team and the market research team. But I think there's a lesson there for all of us, because even in the most supposedly user-centered organization, the most design-led organization, which Intercom absolutely was, we still don't pay attention to language in the right way. We don't treat it as an integral part of design. And we choose names that feel right to us or feel semantically accurate. And content strategists fall victim to this as well. We like to sort of be slavishly accurate about the words that we use instead of thinking about what resonates with our customers. So when we do that, when we choose names that feel right, and we do it late in a project, it often happens that we're depriving people of an essential tool to help them make sense of what we've made for them. It's like we've designed this beautiful door and given it an invisible handle. So what about cost of change? What type of concept definition has a cost? When you're asking your audience to relearn something, and remember, their mental model is something that they bring with them, with terms they've learned from other products and even hacks they've used to kind of get around your system. Even if something is objectively simpler and better for them, there's a cognitive cost for them to learn something new. And that can result in frustration and bottom line cost to you in the form of support calls and so on. Also, when you rename things, you develop a burn list, and this can be really hard for people to adapt to. A word that you used heavily to mean one thing in one part of your product cannot be used somewhere else in your product to mean something totally different. That is just a recipe for disaster. So it's better to introduce a word that's wholly new rather than borrowing from somewhere else. And that brings us to timing. What happens if we introduce a new concept model? And how do we know it's a good time to change a key part of our system? Let's look at this in the context of design systems, because we have Polaris at Shopify, and at Polaris, content as well as colors are all part of the design system, and naming is part of it as well. So design systems serve a couple of purposes. They can help us build quickly, they can help us build more coherently, but they can also start to hold us in place. If a system doesn't change, it starts to stagnate. And in our excitement over efficiency, we can tend to forget that the need to redevelop the system is always there, that we always need to feed in new information to it to keep it alive. And that doesn't happen just because there are new design trends that we want to follow, but because we've learned something new about how people use the system, and we want to use that to transform it and change it. And it's, again, just like a dictionary maker, we need to go outward and see what usage actually tells us about the system and what we should change. So I just wanted to leave you with a final thought, which is that none of this investment in language and coming up with clear concept models means anything if you can't have a culture of change in your organization. That means making concept definition a part of your process and saying that anything is fair game to be analyzed, assessed, and seeing what words actually resonate with your users. When you make sure that everyone on your team understands the world that they're building toward and can actually have a conversation without misunderstanding each other, you unlock this immense power in your team. And your concept model stops being a directive that's just passed down from leadership and starts to become a blueprint that everyone can use. So some tactics to take away today. The first is to design concept first, not surface first. Don't start with your patterns, start with your words. This is probably the thing that I have found most useful as a design leader in working with any kind of UX discipline, to always start with meaning and start with the semantic concepts that we're dealing with, as opposed to starting with the UI or whatever other material we're talking about. The second is to listen to your users, which you wouldn't imagine we would still need to say that, but sometimes it's just human nature and we have to remind ourselves. We have to understand when old patterns and names don't work for audiences or don't work for new audiences, and take time to listen to how other people describe us to ourselves. The third, and I think this is really valuable, is to research your team's mental models. Understand how people internally actually define their system. You can't crowbar a concept model into people's minds any more than you can beam concepts into your users' minds. And if you take the time to do that intentional work and understanding and treat it as a process of discovery, you won't be so defensive about those differences, and those arguments about navigation and IA will stop being quite so fraught. And the last one that I would really advise you to do is to create a glossary and make it public. Just open source your words. And so much of what we create in tech is actually not net new. We have a tendency to want to brand everything, but actually, if everything is branded, the branded things don't stand out. So let's all kind of share our words and share our definitions for things to help everyone. And finally, when you've created some of these tools, don't just give them to your content strategy team or your design systems team and bury them in spreadsheets. If your content team, and hopefully you have some form of content team in your organization, if people are lining up to ask them for help with known terminology, there's something wrong. They are not librarians, they're researchers. And they can help you so much more by framing concepts and helping you design your product for the future. So that's it for me. You can find me and Shopify UX on Twitter, and you can see some of the roles we're currently hiring for, including a content strategy role on my team at the URL above. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't think we have time for Q&A. That's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks
so much.
so much.
Thank you. Words and semantics do matter, and it's amazing to see Jenna talked about it more from a perspective of building inclusive teams, and Elizabeth talked about, of course, from the perspective of building a product.